Hello and welcome to News Without Borders again, and today we're talking about inequality. What's the state of inequality, mainly in the UK, and how did we get to this place of inequality? So, what is the state of inequality and why are we talking about it? So, one figure, the top 10% of British society holds 45% of the wealth, and maybe what we should be more concerned about it, or demonstrates it better, is that the bottom 80% have only 36% of the wealth, according to the Office of National Statistics. So, how can I put that a little bit better? Inequality is now at its worst since the 1930s. In other words, the 1% have a greater share of the income than since the 1930s, right? So that is the age of the roaring 20s, when men in top hats poured champagne over scantily dressed women, and
And it's worse than that now.
Well, something similar anyway.
They do that, but they're just in quiet, behind closed doors.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they were doing it on the Shire in the 20s as well. It's all the films you've been watching.
Behind the doors of Goldman Sachs.
That'll be the films in 80 years' time.
In fact, didn't The Wolf of Wall Street have that thing where they were like bowling with dwarves? So it is worse now.
It's worse than bowling with dwarves.
Anyway, I think what we've done there is made the point that it's bad. We need to care about
Things are bad. Before we get into it, we should also quickly talk about GDP, in the sense that we think we live in a rich society. The OSCE is comprised of those countries that have a high level of GDP.
Right, we're like supposed to be the 6th or 7th richest country in the world, the UK.
It changes depending on our currency, I think, at the moment.
Right.
But
our currency?
it's the strength of our currency, rather. But it depends on. That's not really a good representation. Looking at a country's GDP is not a good representation of how people are doing in that society, right? And even if you take GDP per capita, which takes the GDP, divides it by the population of that country, that's still not a good representation, because we're talking now about inequality and how that is completely shifted to one end of the social spectrum. Alternatively, you could also think that people are in that 1%, in that 10% that have 45% of the wealth in the UK, that they deserve it, that we live in a meritocratic society, a capitalist society that rewards people for working hard. However,
and who can argue that people who work harder and achieve more should not have some kind of greater share of resources, right? Not many people are going to disagree with that unless they're hardline communists.
Yeah.
But then we have the issue of social mobility. So obviously I think Britain has got the lowest rated social mobility in the developed world. So let's just assume all first world countries are considered within that. We have the lowest rated social mobility. Essentially, what that means is that there isn't necessarily, or isn't apparent, equal opportunity. Regardless of wherever you or whatever family you are born into, it does actually matter. You haven't got as much chance of reaching one of those almost aspired to positions or an aspired to level of society if you are born into a disadvantaged or not as wealthy background as maybe if you came from a wealthy family or you've got wealthy parents, high income and so on. So that's actually relative social mobility, whereby the probability, the percentile and so on and so forth. You've got absolute social mobility, which is the overall numbers of people who end up in a different layer of stratification to their parents. So not only is the probability not great for us here in England, but absolutely, according to statistics, it is really quite poor.
Right, we've got this figure here, right? About 7% of the population go to private school, but these people make up 32% of MPs, 51% of top medics, 54% of FTSE 100 chief executives, 54% of top journalists, and 70% of High Court judges.
So what advice would you give to people who want to make it into that social elite?
If you want to be a High Court judge, definitely go back in time and be born with some parents that can send you to private school. I think it's the lesson to take away from this. So we should care about this, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, people should care about this because it affects their chances in life, and definitely anyone who's got a family and can't afford to send their kid to private school, this is something you should be caring about, and this is something as a society we need to be combating. I think that most people could and do agree that equality of not outcome but equality of opportunity is something that we want to strive for.
Right. And in this first part, we're talking about inequality. We're really going to focus on the causes, how we got to this state of affairs, right? In the next part, we are going to talk about really how it affects the world, how it affects your life on a day-to-day basis, economically, and things like that. But it's worth talking about how we got here. So, as always, when we talk about these issues, when we talk about the discontents of capitalism, we do have to go back to Thatcher, right? So, since the 1980s, there's been a strong shift in the economy that's been focusing attention more on the financial sector than the industrial sector. And what that tends to mean, or one example of that, is that between 79 and 89, the financial sector grew by 320%, which is contrasted against the industrial sector, which is something 12.8%. So the massive difference between the way the financial sector was blown up versus the industrial sector. And what that tends to mean is that wealth becomes concentrated among fewer and fewer people. You have that in heavily financialized economies. That's what tends to happen. And the smaller the industrial sector goes, remember the industrial sector is made up of mostly working class people, inevitably that shift is going to occur. And that is one strong reason why we've got to the situation at the moment.
And it's, if you talk about finance being, or the inflation of the financial sector being a key issue in terms of how we got here with, in terms of inequality, then that's scary, because to try and do anything about the finance sector is...
How do you take it on?
How do you take on a machine like that? The City of London, a lot of people say would be the real people who are making the decisions in a UK democracy, right? But then that's a whole other issue maybe we'll get on to later. So I was going to mention something about anti-competitive practices, right? So you've got people who are very ardent believers in the free market, but you're gonna find that they're also the same kind of people who actually believe or don't support governments in enforcing anti-competitive practices. So we've got all these laws which are trying to create a good, free, open market where the market actually works. But that's not actually the case a lot of the time. Like, so some examples: predatory pricing, right? You were going to say something about what Walmart does,
well,
right?
As an example, so if you have Walmart and they were to move into a relatively small or a local town, and they'll bring one of their stores in, and I suppose you could, if you were to align it to the UK, you could talk of a Tesco Express or a Tesco Metro, and I'm not picking on Tesco.
You should.
They could come into a local town and they will come in and they will have amongst their lowest prices, the lowest prices they can provide.
All the local businesses.
Which drives the competition out of business, and then once the competition has been driven out of business, let's make the assumption, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers of society that still exist in these little towns, they will then hike their prices up. So therefore, once they have the monopoly, that's when they'll make their profit.
So this is supposed to be something that actually we prevent people from doing, but a lot of the time, politicians don't want to piss Tesco off, and big people like them, so they will shy away from enforcing these
Bring
practices.
Bring it back to Walmart, because I think it was Walmart, not Tesco. I don't want to be throwing false accusations around.
You do have local communities campaigning against big superstores coming into their local areas, right? And this is a big reason as part of it. So we should be enforcing these things to stop these kind of practices, to create an actual realistic free market. But a lot of the time, people who are supporting the free market don't want to do anything about these things which distort the market, right? So that's one example, predatory pricing. We've also got another one, price fixing. And I want to give you a quote from Adam Smith, right? Who all the gods of the people will see him as a god, everyone who loves the free market. He said, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices." So in other words, if you get people of the same trade together, they're going to think, okay, all right, how can we make more money? And I think the best example of this is LIBOR, right? So when the banks were all fixing the rates on which trillions of loans were dependent upon, from student loans to mortgage rates, that's another example of how this collusion in finance can increase inequality. That's bringing money up towards the banks, and then the rest of society is having to deal with these fixed rates negatively for them. Secrecy is another thing, right? Secrecy. The derivatives market, which again, finance shrouded in secrecy, even though an open market is supposed to promote transparency. Right? So you've got all these different ways in which actually the market is being distorted, and they're all driving inequality.
Also, talk about unions as well. Unions is kind of an important aspect of inequality. You tend to find countries, at least across the OECD, the more of the working class, or the more of the labourers in that country that are represented by some kind of organised union, they tend to drive prices up, they tend to drive income up, drive wages up, and there tends to be, as a result, much less inequality in that society.
There's a very strong correlation between unionisation and the wealth of people who work in labour, right?
It should be mentioned as well that, I mean, this was a big debate in the 70s about whether there was too much union representation. There was a lot of blame put on the shoulders of these union members that decided that after the third time at least to not bring prices down, and that kind of exacerbated inflation at that time. That's kind of a debate for another time, but it's worth mentioning there are two sides of that argument.
Absolutely. But I mean, at the same time as these wages have declined with unions, I mean, corporate governance laws basically put no restrictions on how executives can decide their pay, right? So the shareholders, they don't really get a say. Well, there's no workers on boards in the UK, so they don't get a say. And you've got a situation where in the US, the CEO pay has grown 90 times faster than typical workers since 1978. Just let that sink in. CEO pay 90 times faster than typical workers since 1978. And we should remember that's around the time when unions started to decline, right? So there was no check. So I think another one we have here is tax havens, right? So tax havens is a big problem. The whole idea of cut taxes for the wealthy and they will create jobs is a big part of this neoliberal theory of economic growth. The wealth's going to trickle down, right? And I think the best way of getting to the problem with this is that wealth doesn't trickle down, it just floods offshore, right? There's something estimated at $21 trillion just sitting offshore, right? That's the money that was supposed to trickle down and result in investment and create jobs and so forth. But until we can bring that money in, then there's a significant problem with
It's worth tying that back into the idea of meritocracy as well. If you think about all the things we've just talked about, is that meritocratic? Like the fact that rich people have the ability to use tax havens, the fact that employers have so much power over their employees because of the lack of representation, and therefore that their wages grow substantially more than that of their employees. Is that meritocratic? Do they deserve to have that?
Do you know what? Yeah, there's a kind of two-tier system, right? One set of tax laws for the rich, one for the poor. And I should say, not the poor, one for small to medium business owners, who, by the way, are almost exclusively conservative voters, right? But there's actually a great movement called the Fair Tax Town movement, which lots of small business owners in a given town, they got together and they said, well, why can't we evade tax, right? It's a big way to do it. Why can't we evade tax? So they looked in to getting it done. I think it was a comedian who started this, went into a small town and encouraged them to do it. They worked out that they can do this double Irish Bermuda ham sandwich, whatever you call it. Tax.
That's the official name, I think.
And they're now spreading this across the country, right? And the idea is that once they've got enough small to medium-sized enterprises who are saying, we will all take our business offshore, this is kind of like a negotiating tool for the government. We're going to rob you of all this tax base if you don't make the rules fair. But it's always going to be limited in terms of international action, tax havens. But I should say that the UK has indirect, direct control influence over Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, Gibraltar, all places that are leading tax havens, right? So we should take the lead, I think, in the UK.
So that's it for part one, I think. In the next part, we're going to talk more about how inequality shapes up across society, how it affects your life more directly. We have touched upon a few aspects, we'll go into more detail. So feel free to click below, have a look at the next part, and of course, like, subscribe, follow, etc.
Share. Alright, see you later, guys.